What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more. What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me.
All right, cool. One of the things I'm trying out lately is recording the lectures through Google Hangouts. That way I can try to make it available to people who weren't here or something like that. So that's why I'm going to put this thing around my neck. I don't have a smaller option just yet, but I'm working on that. So I'll look like it's yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's take a look at the Renaissance. Here's the famous painting, Da Vinci's The Last Supper. And this was one example of Renaissance painting. When we talk about some of the things, the changes, you shouldn't get the impression that this was like a big abrupt change, that the people woke up and overnight everything was different. When we talk about any change in history, it usually takes place over a long time, a time in which the people living in it don't really quite understand what's going on. For instance, I mean, we're living in this sort of digital change that's really kind of been going on, if you ask me, for about 20 years, and we're still not quite sure what it means in the end. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe we do. But that's the Renaissance too. We're boiling it down. So here's our main idea. The Renaissance was an era in which classical ideas about science, knowledge, life, and culture were reborn. That's the meaning of the word Renaissance in Italy and spread to the rest of Europe. Your notes probably say spread to the rest of Italy. Cross that out and change it to Europe. So Italy's the starting point. And first I'm going to show you why. Well, I'm going to talk about what the Renaissance was. What do we mean by classical? Show you why Italy was the center of it. Talk about what it was, and then talk about why it spread. So first off, we want to kind of define the term classical. And when we talk about something called Western civilization, we mean a set of societies that are all sort of related in their history and what they pull on as their classics. So what creates the world? The United States is what people would call part of what people call Western society. It would include most of Europe. Sometimes we'd include Russia, but we'll talk about what that means. But classical is supposed to be a form or an example that originates a form. And it might be hard for you to connect the fact that the learning that you do here or the learning you do in other places goes all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome, but that's where its roots are. That's kind of where it gets its start, and that's what the Renaissance brings back or helps it be reborn. So we're talking about Rome and Greece, ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, and Greece. Now, when we talk about Greece, remember, we're not talking about one country. We're talking about a collection of different little city-states. So these things are going to get rediscovered, and that's what the Renaissance is going to be. Okay, so the ancient Greeks and Romans had created lots of different works about art, literature, learning. We should add philosophy in there. And all these things the Greeks kind of originated it. They got the ball rolling. When ancient Rome arises, they take a lot of the same learning, they copy it, they reshape it. But when the Roman Empire falls, a lot of that learning gets lost to Europe. Now, in many cases, the Arabic Muslim world actually preserved a lot of this learning. And so when Europe is able to get this learning back, they do it because they're in contact with the Islamic world, the Ottoman Empire. In fact, a lot of the learning you would do today, a lot of the words that we use come from Arabic words because Islamic culture developed them. When we talk about algebra, when we talk about algorithm or things like that, those all have origins with Arabic words. So anyway, as this learning becomes available to what we're going to call Italians again, they admired the works of the Greeks and the Romans, and they tried to copy and emulate them. Okay, so why Italy? here's the note you really want to put next to it. I'm going to try to sum this up. Why did it happen in Italy? Now, when we say Italy here, we're only talking about a region. There's no nation of Italy. There's probably almost nobody that would think of themselves as Italian. That's not going to happen really until the middle of the 1800s or later. But Italy's here, okay? Mediterranean Sea, and this has a lot of trade routes along it. What do the Europeans want to trade for? Well, European food is kind of not bland, but they have to find ways to preserve it, and also to make it tasty after you've preserved it. If you dry something out, you might want to find something to make it taste a little better. And so what they're interested in are spices from what we call the Far East, or what was called the Far East. That would have been parts of India, where the Mughal Empire is, parts, China itself. China, if you really looked at a country in the world that was the most powerful, it was probably China or the Ottoman Empire. Japan, not so much just yet. So there's lots of goods out here that Europeans want to trade for. And the way into Europe at that time for those trade goods is through Italy, because they can move them across water, which is the fastest and safest way to transport things. Transporting them over land and through Russia, bad move, just through the Ottoman Empire, and then trade along here is kind of the best option that they have. So first part, location. Italy's along trade routes. Works out great for them. Second, well, why? Well, no. Oh, crap. Let's see. Is this pretty? Oh, that's nice. Anyway, second thing you've got in Italy is you don't have feudalism. You don't have kings ruling over nobility, ruling over peasants, and land being the big thing. You have a different setup. The powerful people in Italy at that time are the merchants and the bankers, people who have money, and they make it through trade and banking. How do bankers make their money? They lend money to someone else, and they charge them interest for the money that they've borrowed. So you've got people doing that. Those bankers can then lend money to people who are traders, can lend them money to stock up some ships and get some money to go trade in the East and then bring it back. Now, we'll kind of come back to them in a second. But what was the Renaissance about? Now, we boil this down into 3 isms, which makes it neat and tidy. But you should remember that nobody sat down and hammered these things into a stone tablet and said, these are the values of the Renaissance. These are just what emerged. First, let's talk about humanism. This was the belief that human beings had value and potential. And we'll see how this contrasted with what people might have thought about medieval times. Secularism was a belief that it was worthwhile to focus on non-religious learning and experience. That there were things about the world that were worth understanding and knowing about. If you don't have this, you never get science. And finally, you have individualism. Now, this is not the individualism of me, myself, and I'm what matters, and that I think a lot of people have. This is an idea that part of your life could be a focus on your own achievements, your own ability. That it didn't have to happen within your, you didn't have to live the life of somebody before you. You could achieve something more. Sounds very like, what we tell 8-year-olds. You could be anything you want to be, kind of. What's that? It's a joke. It's just skeptical. So what were they learning about? So Renaissance scholars read some of the things from ancient Greece and Rome and used them to challenge what was going on in the time. Now, the church really has, the Catholic Church, really has, for the most part, control over what's important to know about. If you were talking about education in medieval times and even the early Renaissance, you're talking about the church. There aren't any schools. There's nobody's going to, university or something unless it's being run by the church. So what is the church teaching? Well, first off, they're teaching religious things about Christianity. But the Renaissance thinkers, because you've got people in Italy who can pay to, have a painting done of them or have a sculpture or something to show off their wealth, these Renaissance thinkers are doing other things. They're reading old texts, they're trying to learn, and they're challenging some of the things people have been thinking about. What did they challenge, and where did you see some clashes? Now, it's not out and out and open stuff. These guys are not like, atheists, like down with the church or anything like that. They still believe that the church really has truth in some ways, but they think that it's not just about religious learning. The church might say, look, the only thing you need in life to really live a good life is to achieve salvation. And the way to do that is through the teachings of the church, through the guidance and leadership of the church. So how would they look at humanism? The church would have responded with, look, the Bible shows that humans are naturally evil and sinful, that they're bound to do bad things, and they really aren't worth anything when it comes to being righteous like God. They need something to bridge the gap and get them salvation. Now, the Renaissance thinkers wouldn't have necessarily said that was wrong, but they said there are things we could talk about with human beings that are worth something, how people treat each other and things like that. They also would have said, the church would have said, look, the only learning that's really necessary or even really worth doing is about God and the church. And if that kind of learning can lead to your ultimate salvation or punishment for eternity, they had a point coming from that rationale. But the secularists, or they weren't really secularists, but what they would have said was, there's other things. I mean, why would God have created a world with so many different things in it if he didn't want human beings to try to understand them? Like, how can birds fly? Why does water do what it does? All these, how does light behave? Finally, when it came to individualism, the church would have said, look, someone's own ambition is, again, not really worth anything compared to God's plan. And since the church understands God's plan and is going to help people with it, the individual should just sort of remain obedient. Now, Renaissance life revolved around the city. That's where the wealth was. If you wanted wealth in basically most of the rest of Europe, you would have gone to land. He who had lots of land could grow lots of crops. They had lots of wealth. They could, get lots of knights and things like that. But in Italy, the wealth is contained in trade and banking and having actual, what we would think of as money. So someone's wealth and their ability mattered more than their nobility or how much land they owned. And in Italy, you don't have a lot of really rich, wide spaces of land anyway, so it's tough to get. You also get a middle class. You get a group of people who are neither very rich nor very poor, who work and don't own land, but also have extra income they can spend on things. That's going to be important. You do have peasants there. They still make up the lowest class. Throughout history, where there's always going to be poor people. So what's Renaissance art? The best way I can show you is actually to skip this one and try to show you a comparison. We'll go back. So medieval times, the sole focus of art was either leadership, like kings and stuff, or religion. Christianity in particular. Why? Because the church and the leaders are the ones that have money to pay for art. You don't have people, there's nobody like grabbing an easel and getting themselves a little apartment and, doing art for art's sake and painting. And no, these people are funded by somebody. Somebody's paying for this. Nobody's going to art school, okay? So in medieval painting, it's symbolic. The goal is to try to show things that happened or try to represent ideas to people, especially in churches where most of the people couldn't read even their local language. So you painted nice pictures for them, or you did stained glass, or you did something that could show these stories that you're telling them about. So medieval painting, typically flat, and like I said, symbolic. Let's look at the Renaissance. Renaissance painting did all sorts of things. They added depth, for instance. You know that this is a trick of the eye right here. This is flat. This is flat. You know this is flat. It's a painting. But our eyes, even though we know we couldn't stick our hand into the painting, our eyes pick up depth here. We know that the painter was trying to represent that these people are further away. And this thing is a little door, and it's far away. And here's some people much closer. So Renaissance painters couldn't just, not to do this, not to say you didn't have to have skill, but you didn't need to know a lot about geometry, for instance. You didn't need to understand things like the way our eyes work. But this is geometry. You need to know a little bit of something about what's called in art the vanishing point, which is right in the center of the picture, and is where everything sort of, the horizon basically meets the rest of the painting. Also, you might get secular themes. This is not really a religious theme here. It's sort of just people hanging out. There might be some religious overtones, but people would paint other things. And the Mona Lisa is an example of that. The Mona Lisa is not religious. There's no religious meaning to it. It's just a painting of a woman in front of a background, a sort of country scene. Now, not to say that the Renaissance painters didn't paint religious things. They still did. The Sistine Chapel and, all these things. The church still funds a lot of the art that's going on. But people started to use more new techniques for more lifelike representations. I showed you that. You can talk about architecture too, but I won't. You can look at that one if you want to. Let's talk about sculpture. Medieval times. Sculptures were sort of stiff. The emotion was not something that you really needed to represent. And in fact, if the painting and sculpture were pretty similar. I mean, they made very little attempt to try to make these people's faces look different. They're, this guy just has a mustache, and this guy's just got curly hair, and this guy's just got a cowboy hat or whatever that is. So sculpture is going to be pretty similar. The idea is represent the event, represent the story, but not necessarily the people, what they feel. But sculptors in the Renaissance were interested in depicting humans in a more lifelike way. What does the human body look like? And you can't learn this just by studying human bodies. Well, maybe, but you need like anatomy, for instance. You don't understand how to chisel this guy's six-pack right here unless you've studied the muscles of the abdomen. You don't know how to get this bicep quite right unless you know how those muscles form. There's other parts that you might have needed to study to get them right. So now painting, again, you have to understand, when we talk about today, we're often talking about really specialized stuff. What do you teach? You teach history. What do you teach? You teach science. What do you teach? You teach math. So somebody today that still studies a lot of different things is called a Renaissance man, because the painters or the artists in the Renaissance, if you ask them what they did, they wouldn't have said, I'm an artist. That's what I do. They would have said they were into a lot of things, and they were. Da Vinci wasn't just a painter or a sculptor. He was an inventor. He studied astronomy. He studied mathematics. He studied anatomy. Saw the pretty pictures. Okay, so that's basically a real quick look at the Renaissance itself. What happened to its spread? Why did it go other places? That starts in Italy. In the last class, there was somebody who thought it had started in England, even though I'd shown them a map of Italy, and it says Italy, 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 and then anyway. So what happens? It spreads to other places. We're going to look at France, England, and the Netherlands. And it happens in lots of different ways. The printing press is the big part of this. The printing press, teachers like to do this where they're like, it was like the text messaging of the 1500s. And, it's like, no, it's not. It's not really. Not the way we use text messaging. But it was in a way that it meant that you could communicate with many more people than you could before. If you could come up with an idea and get it on a piece of paper through movable type, you could print thousands of copies of it that you could spread all over the place. Now, that doesn't seem like such a big deal now, but the change of we had to copy it by hand into now we can make multiple copies of it within hours is really a big change. It means people can take their ideas, take things that they've done, and share them with other people. What's the French Renaissance all about? They got into the architecture thing to create chateaux, which were beautiful palaces. French Renaissance writers started new forms of writing. There's almost no such thing as fictional writing in medieval times. There's some. You get the Canterbury Tales a little bit, stuff like that. But the idea of writing about those types of things starts to grow a little bit more. So French writers would have wanted to know about love, this thing that to many of them would have been incomprehensible but worth looking at. What is it? Why does it happen? They would have looked at things like the passing of youth. What did it mean for people to get old and eventually die? How could people sort of live beyond the grave? Were the works that they're created, like poetry and writing and learning, was that something worth, or was it all just lost when you die? So they would have said, look, this focus on the afterlife, they would have said, yeah, this is important, of course. I mean, obviously, if you're going to, as many Catholic Christians believe, spend eternity in either a place of bliss or eternal punishment, it's worth trying to figure out how to get to one or the other. But they would have said that it's also worth thinking about things that make a good life worth living. About what we call the Northern Renaissance. This was the Netherlands and Germany. And they took the Renaissance and applied it to their religion in an effort to try to make it better, try to reform it. And we'll look at some of those reformers tomorrow. The big push here would have been that people could study the Bible for themselves, and that the Catholic Church really had gotten past what Christianity was all about. They would have looked at some of the big cathedrals, for instance, which were hugely expensive, or they would have looked at the different rituals the church carried out and said, look back at the early Christians. It was nothing like this. How did this happen? Why can't we get back to what it was actually like when it first started? The pure form of it, they might have thought about. They would have encouraged people to learn to read. The problem is that if you want to read the Bible in this time, you have to learn ancient Greek and or Latin. You can't do it in your local language, but that'll change tomorrow. How about the English Renaissance? They were interested in social issues. Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia, in which he described what he thought of as the ideal society. And people began to think, maybe if human beings could think about the problems human beings have, you could figure them out. And if you could figure them out, maybe one day you could figure all of them out. It was early. It was early in that line of thinking. William Shakespeare was interested in social issues as well, but also the regular ones we all have. So that wraps up our quick look at the Renaissance. Here's the main idea. The Renaissance was an era in which classical ideas about science, knowledge, life, and culture were reborn in Italy and spread to the rest of Europe. Take 2 minutes. I want you to look back over your notes, and then I want you to look at the last two note slides here. I ask you to grade out your notes. A 3 is full credit. I'm not going to, you're just grading yourself out. You're giving yourself feedback here. 2 means you did it most of the time. Remember, you're looking to be complete, focused, and original. So take 2 minutes and grade out your own notes. Go. Let's see, did it work? Oh, I got one viewer.